Welcome to the church family that is lifting lives through living love, inspiring hope, filling with faith, and transforming our world. These recorded messages are made available so that you might have additional opportunities to stay connected with us and that you might learn and grow in your faith. God bless you as you hear the word today. And now, the message.
Good morning. Our reading this morning comes from Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, your father's household, to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on the earth will be blessed through you." May the Lord add his blessing to the reading and hearing of his word.
Well, in my childhood, there was an infamous story that got told again and again and again as I grew up. It involved my mom, my brother, a lawnmower, and a flashlight. Now, when I was growing up, my brother and I split duties when it came to mowing the lawn. I got to mow the front lawn, which is a little bit smaller. He had to mow the back lawn. He was the older brother, so he got the bigger job, which was a little bit larger, which he claimed always grew faster. I'm not sure if that's true or not. I do know it's true that the backyard, the mom's requirement was the backyard had to be bagged because we had dogs. She didn't want the dogs bringing in the grass clippings, and so that added a lot to the job. But, I kind of enjoyed being the younger son and kind of got away with it, right? So one particular summer, I think my brother was maybe a freshman in high school, something like that. He let the lawn go for an extended period of time, like a handful of weeks. And it's not like Indiana. Like right now, I can let my lawn go a handful of weeks and you'd never know. But I lived in Tennessee and the lawn kind of took off and it reached at one point, like shin height, and mom was like, "You have to go out there." It was some Saturday. She said, "You have to do it before the end of the day." And he said, I promise, Mom, I'm going to do it. She said, "Okay." But then as the day went on, it was a really hot day, so he just kind of kept putting it off, waiting until it cooled down a little bit. And she would say, "Stephen, you got to get out there." And he'd say, "I'm going to get to it, Mom." And so finally, at the end of the day, he started the job. And normally, mowing the back lawn was only like 30, 45 minutes to do it, even with the bag. But Stephen drastically underestimated how much time it was going to take because of the height of the lawn. Like, you know how the lawn is when it's really high. You can't go very fast. So he was mowing at a snail's pace. If he went any faster, the lawnmower would bog down. On top of that, he had to empty this bag out, and he couldn't even go a single strip back and forth without having to stop and empty the bag and then restart it again. And so what was normally a short job took hours. He'd been at it for about 2 hours when the sun started to go down and he came in. He was hot and sweaty and tired. And Mom looked at him and said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, the sun's going down." She said, "The lawn is only half done. Get back out there." And he says, "I can't see, Mom." And she gave him a flashlight and said, "Here you go. Now you can see." And so for the next 2 hours, when it was completely dark, my brother was out there and all the neighbors could see this flashlight slowly going back and forth across the lawn and stopping every once in a while to empty the bag, So my friends in high school and beyond, we never let my brother live this story down, that he had to go out there and mow in the dark. But the thing is, we learned a lesson. I learned it just by watching my brother. He learned it by personal experience. And the lesson was this, is that if you say you're going to do something, you never stop halfway through. Whether you are mowing a lawn or shearing a sheep, I found that little Google image. I thought, poor sheep, only half sheared. Or whether you're Thanos snapping your fingers and only killing half the universe, if you only do half the job, it's going to come back to haunt you. Now, why do I start off my sermon this way? I guess because I recognize that today is a celebration in our church. It's a milestone in our journey, but yet we know, just looking around, that we are not there. Like from where we were to where we are today, we are just beginning this journey. And even as a country, we have not arrived when it comes to fighting coronavirus and COVID. Like I said at the beginning of the service, we see this resurgence in a lot of states and even here locally in Indiana. And so it's a reminder that we still have a long way to go, and we have to remain vigilant and not do the job halfway. That we need to, and that means, I think, practicing safety in public and practicing care in private, and especially in our prayers, praying for those who are sick or vulnerable, those who are isolated, praying for our doctors and our decision makers, all those people who are on the front lines, and continuing to be vigilant as we go through this journey, because this is just, we don't know how long this journey is going to take, but we have to be committed to see it all the way through. And that's probably also why I felt drawn to the Abraham and Sarah story, because theirs is a story about journey, and it's a long journey. And where the story starts is actually somewhere around the halfway point, believe it or not. Abram is 75 years old, and believe it or not, he's halfway through his journey. So if you go back, one verse, like we started in Genesis chapter 12, if you go back to Genesis chapter 11, go to the previous slide for just a moment. There's stuff about Abram's family and origins, but there's this line in here I want you to see. So Terah, who is his father, took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, his daughter-in-law Sarah, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they got to Haran, they settled there. So they're making a journey from Ur to the land of Canaan. So what does that look like? Now we can go to our map. So Ur of the Chaldeans is kind of where Babylon would end up later in history. And Canaan is all the way across the desert. The most direct route was impossible. You couldn't just go marching across the desert. People would die along the way. You couldn't sustain animals and so forth. So instead, what Abram's family did is they went north along the Euphrates River, and they intended to go back south down the Mediterranean. Except when they got to the halfway point, what did they do? They settled. They stopped. They're like, hey, this is far enough. The land is green. The people are nice. Let's just make our home here. And so they did. Now, we don't know how old Abram was when he started this journey. We know that he was into his adult life. He was already married to Sarah at that point. But he settled there probably for a long time, 30 or 40 years, enough to kind of establish himself there in the city, the land of Haran. And then God's voice comes to him. And what's God's voice say? Leave. Leave your country, your people, your father's household. Go to the land that I will show. These are the operative words. Leave and go, because this halfway point is not where you're meant to stay. This is not where you are meant to settle. My story for you, Abram, is not a halfway salvation, a halfway legacy, a half inheritance. I want you to go all the way. And so you have to leave where you have settled and go to the land that I will show you. Now, any of us who have ever moved before know the anxiety that moves produce, right? Like there's this feeling of going into an unknown, whether it's moving jobs or moving a house. Like there's this anxiety about we'd much rather stay where everything is known and comfortable. And so God quickly follows up this command with a series of promises. There are 5 I will statements that follow. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. In other words, I will be your protector. I will go with you all the way. And so Abram trusts in the I wills, the promises that God makes, and he obeys the command. And he packs all his things and he goes. So Abram left as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, all their possessions that they accumulated, all the people they had acquired, and they set out for the land of Canaan. And isn't this funny? And they arrived there. It's like the shortest story in the world, right? Like God told him to go, and less than 2 verses later, they arrived End of story, all clean, right? Except that is nowhere near the end of Abram's story. Because once he arrives, he doesn't just stay there. If you follow his journey, it always reminds me of like, whenever I see these like maps, like they always remind me of like the family circus and Billy wandering all over the backyard, because Abram didn't just stay in Canaan. He moved south because there was famine. He had to go down into Egypt. He got into a little bit of trouble in Egypt, partially of his own doing. And so then he had to go back up north, except this time he settled in a different region, a little further south. Then he and Lot got in a land dispute, and so they split, and he went east. And then after a while, Abram, got in trouble with the Hittites there, so he moved back into the south. He was constantly on the move for 60 years after this promise, this call that God gave him. And it's not until his wife Sarah dies that he, for the very first time, buys property, that he becomes a deeded landowner. He's living among the Hittites at the time, and he approaches the king of the Hittites, and he says to them, he says, then Abram rose from beside his dead wife, and he spoke to the Hittites, and he said, I am an alien and a stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site so I can bury my dead. I just want you to listen to that. Abram, whom God had watched over, protected, made rich, yet even at the end, 60 years later, when his wife dies, he still defines himself as a foreigner. A man who lives among people whose culture and beliefs I do not share, whose language and everything is different. He is a sojourner and a pilgrim through and through. Here's my point. For Abram, the call was not about a place. If it was about a place, he would have arrived there in 2 verses and the story would have been over. The call was not about a place. The call was about a promise. And the call was about learning to trust in God's promise no matter where he was. That's what the journey is about. Walter Brueggemann is one of my favorite Old Testament theologians. I have his Theology of the Old Testament. It's kind of a thick book. But he kind of says in the chapter 11 and 12, when we get to Abram, it introduces a new dimension into the character of God. For the first 11 chapters of Genesis, God is understood primarily as a creator. God is the creator who creates everything we see. But when it gets to chapter 12, we get to a new motif, a new understanding of God. That God isn't just creator, God is also a promise maker and a promise keeper. And on the promises of God hang the future and security of all creation. And because God is a promise keeper, then promises are foundational to who we are as people, because we're created in the image of God, that it's foundational. It's what holds the whole world together. God is a promise maker and a promise keeper. And so you see these promises get repeated again and again and again in Abraham's story. It starts, the one we just looked at today, I will make you a great nation and I will bless you. But that, it's not just one time God promises, but God repeats and expands the promise. So the next chapter, while he's in the land of Hebron, he takes, Abram up to a cliff and he says, lift up your eyes from where you are. Look north and south, east and west. All this land that you see, I will give you and your offspring forever. And then a couple chapters later, Abram is complaining. He says, you said you were going to give land to my offspring, but I have no children. My servants are going to inherit all of my property, all of my wealth. And so then God repeats the promise. He says, instead of look around at the land now, he says, look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. So shall your offspring be. So God keeps repeating to Abram again and again and again his promise. And he keeps expanding it. It's not just that I'm going to be with you and I'm going to bless you, and those who curse you I'm going to curse, but he says I'm going to give you land so that you may be settled and so that your people can have a future and a legacy, and I'll give you offspring. You are going to have a son. The question of the Abraham story is not whether God makes or keeps promises. The question is whether Abram is going to trust and believe in them. That's what the story is about. A handful of weeks ago, I mentioned Lewis Smedes in a sermon. Did more than mention while Seth and I were talking about forgiveness. I shared his cycle of forgiveness. He also has a lot of amazing and wonderful things to say about the power of promises. It comes from a sermon he wrote called The Power of Promises. And in it, he articulates 3 different things that promises do. The first thing he says is that promises shape our identity. He says, some people ask, who am I? And they expect the answer to come from their accomplishments, that their accomplishments define them. Some people ask, who am I? And they expect the feeling to come from their emotions. Some people ask, who am I? And they expect the answer to come from other people's opinion of them. He says, but those who dare to make and keep promises know that their identity is forged by the promises they have made and the promises they have kept. He quotes from literature a play, A Man for All Seasons, which, if you're familiar with the play, it's the story of St. Thomas More, who was martyred for his commitment to the Catholic Church, for his unwillingness to recant and embrace the Protestant Reformation. And there's this scene in the play where his daughter Meg comes to him and begs him and says, Daddy, recant. Just say whatever they want you to say so you can live. And bending down to his daughter Meg, he says, Meg, when a man makes this promise, it's like he holds himself like water in his hands. And if he opens them, he dares not hope to find himself again. When we make a promise, we hold ourselves in our hands, and our identity depends on keeping the promises that we've made. This is not only do promises create our identity, they also create community. They create relationships. All relationships, when you think about it, depend on the power of a promise. And there can be significant relationships in your life. Promises between husband and wife, or promises between parents and children, or promises between friends. Like, all of these promises are kind of what bind people together. But even in contractual ways, in business and teams, like, we depend on people to fulfill their words. And it's the way governments and societies work. I'm going to read this so I can get it exactly right, because his words, especially when you think about what's happening in our country right now. Lewis Smedes writes, says, when you get right down to it, everything we do together, from a nation conceived and born in liberty to a family reunion, from a successful political campaign to a winning baseball season, from a United Nations organization to a church picnic, everything hangs on the thin thread of promises made and promises kept. When we break our promises, we lose trust. And without trust, no law, no police force, no legal contracts can keep a community together. The fact is that we are a people who can join together in a permanently free society only if we are people who can keep promises together. I find that so powerful. We live in a world and a culture that cheapens and devalues promises, but what Lewis Smedes is saying is when we do that, things fall apart. It's promises that hold us together. And then lastly, promises help determine our future. G.K. Chesterton once wrote, says, when a man makes a promise, he makes an appointment with himself at a distant time and place. And then he sacrifices whatever the cost may be in order to keep that appointment with himself. Lewis Smedes puts it this way. He says, what a marvelous thing a promise is. When a person makes a promise, she reaches out into an unpredictable future and makes one thing predictable. She will be there, even when being there costs her more than she wants to pay. When a person makes a promise, he stretches himself out into circumstances which no one could control, and he controls at least one thing, that he will be there, no matter what the circumstances turn out to be. With one simple word of promise, a person creates an island of certainty in a sea of uncertainty. Now, I can think of all the uncertainty that exists in our world today, and yet promises create this island of certainty, right? And that's what it did for Abraham too. When you think about all this uncertainty that Abraham faced as he left a familiar world and country to go into a land that God would show him, the only thing he had to hang on was God's promise. But God's promise, what did it do? It created an identity for him. It created a community which would be the foundation of the nation of Israel, and it determined a future that was better than the place where he was at the moment. Back to Brueggemann for just a moment. Brueggemann makes the point that God's promises, especially in the Abram story, but throughout all of Scripture, are frequently in conflict with the circumstances of life around us. Take Abram's story, right? What did God promise him? He promised him land. And yet for 60 years, Abram had no land. He had wealth, he had property, he had servants, he had animals, herds of animals, but he had no land. For 60 years, he had to continue to trust that God would provide land for him and for his descendants. And speaking of descendants, that was the second promise. God promised him a son. And yet from the time that God first promised it to the time Sarah gave birth to Isaac, 25 years went by. And in that whole time, they watched the years ticking by, and they were not spring chickens. They thought Sarah was old, barren. It was impossible. And so this conflict between circumstance and promise, it prompts the question, which one do we trust? Which one do we believe? Which one tells our story? And this isn't just Abram's choice that he has to choose which one to believe. It's the choice throughout Scripture. David has to choose it. The prophets have to decide which is more important, circumstances or promise. The people of Israel, when they were slaves in Egypt, when they were exiles in Babylon, again and again and again, they had to choose which do we trust and believe in, our present circumstances or the promise of God. Brueggemann puts it this way. He says, Israel has known ever since the barrenness of Sarah that there is a deep incongruity between the promises of Yahweh and the circumstance of lived experience. And this creates for them a crucial choice. Israel can accept the circumstance of its life as the true state of reality. And thus, for example, Sarah is barren and the promise is voided within one generation. Or Israel can choose to rely on Yahweh's oath as a resolve to override circumstance, so that it is the oath and not the circumstance that tells the truth about reality. I love that last line. It is the oath, not the circumstance, that tells the story of reality. So which is it? Is it our present circumstances? A nation that's pretty well divided right now? Coronavirus that we are still trying to figure out how to battle and seems to be raging, not just in our country, but around the world. Is that our story? Or is our story about a promise? A promise that God made even before Abram to Noah, a promise of protection and care for all creation. Which will we trust? You see, when we just give in to circumstance, what are we left with? Despair. But if we trust in the promise gives hope, no matter what the circumstances may be. So I would add that to Lewis Mead's, that the promises create identity and they hold together community and they determine our future. But more than anything else, the promise is what sustains our hope, that there is a brighter future, a better story ahead for all of us. And so which do you choose to trust today? My hope is that all of us can trust in the promise of God. And to me, that means believing, trusting that God is good and that God is working for good, that God is able to take even difficult and troubling circumstances and somehow in the midst of them work a story of redemption, a story of grace for our entire world. In just a moment, Frank's going to play a song. And as you listen to the song, I just want you to think about Abraham and Sarah and how the promise of God called them into a new story. And maybe think about where you are too and what it would take for you to leave and go. To not just settle, with a halfway faith, that says, as long as circumstances are good, as long as everything's going my way, then I will trust in God. But to trust God where you are, to know that God is working even now to bring about good things, a good hope, a good future for you and for our world.
Sarah, take me by my arm. Tomorrow we are Canaan bound, where westward sails the golden sun, and Hebron's hills are amber crowned. So bid your troubled heart be still. The grass, they say, is soft and green. The trees are tall and honey-filled. So Sarah, come and walk with me, like the stars across the heavens flung, like water in the desert sprung, like the grains of sand are many suns. O Sarah, fair and barren one, come to Canaan, come. I trembled at the voice of God, a voice of love and thunder deep. With love it means to save us all, and love has chosen you and me. Long after we are dead and gone, for 1,000 years our tale be sung, how faith compelled and bore us on, how barren Sarah bore a son. So come to Canaan, come, where westward sails the golden sun, Hebron's hills are amber crowned. Oh, Sarah, take me by my arm. Tomorrow we are Canaan bound.